challenges online supply management tools pose for B2B marketers. My name is Jim Naris, and I'm going to be joined by my colleague Michelle Stewart, and we're going to be talking about a series of research studies that we've undertaken recently that look at the increasing use of digital tools by business-to-business supply managers and purchasing managers. The good news is we're going to skip the statistics and the academic analyses, and we're going to focus in on managerial insights. Let's begin with a quotation from Forrester Research that captures the importance of this topic area to B2B marketers today. The sentence goes as follows: today's purchasing and supply managers complete over 57% of the buying process before they ever contact a supplier representative. Now, there's several implications of this. The first of which, from the buying side, is that the buying process is different. And it's so different that pundits have changed the name from buying process to customer journey. So we're going to be using the term customer journey quite frequently here today. A customer journey basically refers to the steps that the buyer goes through from the point they realize that they need to find a solution to a particular product, all the way through buying the product, getting it delivered, using it, and then hopefully repeat buying from that supplier over a period of time. From a marketer standpoint, what this implies is that there's got to be a difference in terms of the way salespeople and marketers interact with the customer. If the customer is going to complete 57% of the task, the question becomes, what is it that sales and marketing people are going to do? Now, the obvious solution to that is that they have to increasingly become part of the value added that goes along with the product and not just basically recount the product and its benefits. All right, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle, and she's going to give you a little bit of background information about what's causing this change.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Hello, everyone. So given the substantial change in the way that B2B sales and customers are interacting and the timing of this decision-making process in which they're interacting, it begs the question, what's really different? And this is what Jim and I set out to discover. There are really three factors of the market that further affect this customer journey that we're focused upon. And the first is, according to the U.S. Department of Labor statistics, purchasing management positions are expected to grow by only 2% from 2014 to 2020. That's among the lowest of the growth rates for all managerial positions and is important when we're looking at this particular area. The second is, as professionals are retiring and new entrants are entering the field, we see more and more purchasing professionals who grew up with access and reliance on technology to get information enter the field. And they tend to trust that this information is gained online and available. Projections are that nearly half of all purchasing professionals today are millennials. That's that generational cohort born between 1982 and 2004. The third factor that can affect this customer journey is digital technology itself, and whether it's from e-procurement software or e-catalogs and supply management contracts. It's really automated much of this routine and traditional buying process, so change is abound. Now, in this next slide, if you're viewing from your laptop or your cell phone, you'll notice on the y-axis we have dollars, and then on the x-axis we actually have different types of product to look at overall spend. And the important piece here is that not all acquisitions are the same. This Pareto chart narrows down spend by those elements with the highest annual spend. The purpose of this chart is to identify the most important of a large set of factors. This comes from this old adage from the late 1890s of what is now called the Pareto principle, that 80% of the effects come from 20% of the causes. The key here is that for any given company, the vast majority of expenditures are to purchase products and services that aren't necessarily strategically important to the outcomes of the firm. So for suppliers, the key question becomes, do you know if your products and services are strategic or non-strategic to the customer's mission? The first thing that today's marketing person should be asking is whether or not they're selling a strategic or non-strategic product. It makes all the difference in the world. These non-strategic purchases for a customer often have a different path to purchase that's critical for a supplier to understand to be maximally successful. This is really a sweet spot for the use of digital tools. Next, Jim's going to describe for us the modern decision-making process that's emerged from our research. Jim?
Okay, let's start off by talking a little bit about our research. During the past year and a half, Michelle and I have been in the field. We conducted over 78 face-to-face or telephone interviews with supply and purchasing managers, and then we followed this up with a series of online surveys of purchasing and supply managers. We collected somewhere around 1,300 responses. So what we're going to talk about today is data-driven as opposed to merely our opinions. Now, what I'm going to go through are the 8 steps that these respondents told us constitute the current customer journey. A couple of things I want to say before we get into this. First of all, we're going to be talking from the buyer's standpoint as opposed to the marketer's standpoint. We're going to take what they said and hopefully give you some advice and suggestions on what you need to do as a marketer. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each one of these 8 steps, explain it, and then I'm going to give you an example of some of the tools that purchasing and supply managers are using today. Now, a couple of things I need to say about that. The first of which is that you'll find in each of these 8 categories, there are a lot of tools that are available out there. And as a matter of fact, I can say that there is no one supplier today who basically dominates each one of them. In a lot of categories, there's at least 50 suppliers that provide these software tools or apps. And related to that, I want to say that I'll give you some examples of the ones that came up frequently, but we're not endorsing one versus another. And part of the reason for that is that these things have to be customized to a specific buyer's situation, so there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution at this point. So let's go over the 8 recurring buying tasks of today's customer journey based on what we found. All right, step 1 is scouting for emerging trends and technology. That is, keep an ear to the ground to find out what's coming along. Secondly, searching for suppliers and products. Third is assessing and monitoring supplier financial and legal risk. 4 is verifying supplier certifications and compliance. 5, reviewing sustainability practices and green products. 6, comparing alternate suppliers and products. 7, what we'll call transaction management. And 8, managing ongoing supplier relationships and performance. So what you can see here is that there are a couple of new steps that you probably haven't thought of that are important to buyers and supply managers that you need to address. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each one of these and give you some tidbits. All right, step 1 is to scout for emerging trends and technologies. What is this all about? Well, as Michelle pointed out, the nature of purchasing is changing, and increasingly companies are holding supply and purchasing managers responsible for keeping an ear open for new technologies. Now, these are the kinds of things that that they're probably several years down the pike, 5 years or so. It's not exactly clear how the customer company could use them today, but maybe 5 years from now, as the technology matures, all of a sudden there will be an application. By keeping up with this, the customer company will be available to jump on a new technology when it becomes commercially available. All right, how do they scout? Where do they scout for this information? There are 4 icons that you can see here, and let me just sort of run through each one of these. First and foremost, the purchasing people we talk to rely on online resources from trade associations. Now, this turned out to be very surprising to us because the word in the street is that trade associations are not as important these days as they were in the past. And in fact, we find the opposite to be true, that in fact trade associations are important. So for example, the key trade association for purchasing and supply managers is the Institute for Supply Management. And if you go to their site, they have all kinds of studies and reports. Perhaps most importantly is their market trend reports that talks about what's going on in the marketplace. Now, in addition to trade associations, increasingly we find that customers are relying on online professional communities. Now, an online professional community is one that's typically specific to an industry and or a job or functional area. So there are a number of these in purchasing. The one that I have listed here is called Procurious, which is based out of Australia, and it's a place that purchasing professionals can go online and chat with other professionals around the world and find out what new technologies are emerging and what's going on that they need to know about. The third tool that we found to be important was similarly surprising, and that is email from supplier promotions. Now, the key is that the purchasing people want these emails to be focused on learning. So rather than giving your standard boilerplate marketing sell, what they want is to be able to learn something. So they will review your email as long as they come away with some new knowledge. Now, a fourth source are online market reports. The most commonly used one is from the Wall Street Journal. They have a whole section on logistics. Other sources are provided by universities. So, for example, the Harvard Business Review has a series of these reports which talk about new technologies and new business practices. All right, so step one, scouting for emerging trends and technologies. All right, when I do know what it is that I want, I need to search for specific suppliers and products. So that's step number two. What are the tools that are used? Well, perhaps not surprisingly, search engines are probably the most popular, and today everyone uses Google or Bing or Yahoo. So that there's been so much written about search engines that hopefully you're up to speed on this. Now, there are a number of other sources, and let me just sort of tick these off for you. First of all, there are a series of social media-based sites. So the example that we have here is a Toronto-based company called Tealbook. And basically what Tealbook is and the term that's used in IT is social listening site. And basically what they will do is that they will go out and they will give you a listing of which suppliers have been mentioned and what has been said about a particular supplier. You can provide them with a list of suppliers, or you can ask them to tell you which suppliers have gotten the most favorable comments. So that it's a way to operate or to identify the better supply companies that are out there based on what various people are saying on social media. Once again, online professional communities are important. What a better place to find out about suppliers but to go online to one of these communities and talk to your peers. Now, the little icon that I have here is a site that's popular here in the United States, which is Buyers Meeting Point. Now, one of the things I can say about the online professional communities in B2B versus consumer is that increasingly the buyers want these sites to be vetted and that to have participants validated or checked out in advance. And the reason is that you want to be relying on information provided by true professionals, true peers, as opposed to college students in their dormitory who have been paid to say things. All right, online catalogs are another example, and the one that we have shown here is thomasnet.com. Now, those of you that are old enough remember the old Thomas Register books, And in those books, they listed by product category the alternate vendors. Well, today you can go online to thomasnet.com, key in a particular type of product, and it will give you a list of potential suppliers. Now, on the page for a given supplier, they have a brief summary, and then they have a link to the supplier's website. Now, if I'm a marketer, the key thing that I want to do is to make sure that the page that appears on Thomasnet gives the information that I want my potential customers to get. I want to feed to my home page, and then I want to have the information available on my website that is exactly what customers need to determine if I should be considered as a supplier. All right, the last one that we mentioned was another surprise, and that is that it turns out that trade shows are becoming increasingly important. Now, these trade shows can be real world or online trade shows. Surprisingly, one of the comments that we heard from several supply managers is that increasingly the only time they meet with suppliers face-to-face is during a trade show. So that's one of the few times where you can forge a face-to-face relationship with a prospective customer. So trade shows, once again, are important. All right, so step number 2 is searching for suppliers and products. All right, now, step number 3, assessing supplier, financial, and legal risk. Now, this turned out to be important for us in that what we found is that, supplier risk turns out to be a critical decision-making factor that virtually everyone that we spoke to talked about. Yet they similarly said that sales and marketing people rarely point out or talk about supplier risk during sales presentations or meetings, which is surprising. Your typical supplier salesperson talks about product features, perhaps benefits, perhaps product applications, and obviously they talk about price and hopefully cost, but they rarely talk about risk. Now, we find that there are several sources that these purchasing folks go to. The first of which, and I'll start at the bottom of the page, are supplier websites. So I assume that your company, as well as most companies, has a site that provides various supplier financial information. Now, the big criticism that we've gotten from supply and purchasing managers is that most of these sites provide financial information that's useful for investment purposes, but it's not useful for a purchasing manager to assess financial and legal risk. So advice number 1 is to make sure that your website has financial and legal information that is designed to allay any fears that a customer firm might have. And as a matter of fact, I would say take this one step further and say that if your salespeople are out calling on prospective customers, they should have a brief summary that looks at the hopefully solid financial foundation that the company is based on, the fact that your firm can in fact deliver products correctly and in a reliable fashion, and that you're not facing any legal risk. Now, if the website is not important, it turns out that there are a whole host of risk assessment sites that are out there. As a matter of fact, there's 2 flavors of these, and often they are mixed together. But there's the first of which is risk assessment, so that what they will do is they will take a look at a company and determine whether it's credit worthy, whether its liquidity and leverage ratios are appropriate, and just sort of make a call on what the probability of them messing things up will be. So risk assessment is the first of which, and most of you are familiar with Dun & Bradstreet's, which is the outfit that most companies will mention. And then you have ongoing risk monitoring services, and by that, things happen, companies go downhill, And suppliers want to know when customers want to know when a potential supplier is facing some kind of financial or legal risk. And there's a number of services out there that do this. The ones that we find that are important are Risk Methods, Metric Stream, and Rapid Ratings. And obviously there are quite a few others that are out there. So again, I want to underscore the importance of step number 3, which is assessing supplier financial legal risk. If you want to make a difference, if you want to be more successful, make sure that there's a component of your sales presentations and marketing literature that deal with the risk associated with doing business with you. All right, step number 4 is to verify supplier certifications and compliance. Obviously, quality is high on the minds of a lot of buyers as well as customer companies, as well as can you deliver on your product performance claims. And obviously certifications are the ones that they look to, and you can find these through ISO 9000 certificates, for example, through the International Organization for Standardization. They give extensive listings about the certifications that they have provided. The American Society for Quality, ASQ, is another outfit that these folks are turned to get guidance. Now, obviously everyone is into compliance these days, whether it comes to environmental regulation compliance or legal compliance, you name it. And there's a whole series of compliance management services. The two that we have here are Metric Stream and Thomson Reuters. And basically what they'll do is that they will, as you can see from the chart on the left, is that they will indicate the extent to which a given prospective supplier is in compliance with whatever rules and regulations are important in that particular industry. So step number 4 is critical: verifying supplier certifications and compliance. All right, step number 5, which is new to the idea of a customer journey, and that is reviewing sustainability practices and green products. And this turns out to be critical in a lot of companies today, most particularly companies that are in the food industry, companies that are in pharmaceuticals or not alike. And there's something like 86 different online sites that will give you some sort of sustainability or green product rating scores. The ones that we mention here are probably the most common or popular, and that's the Bloomberg ESG disclosure scores. Now, Bloomberg puts these together largely for prospective investors who want to put their money into companies that are green, so that they have scores for most of the large companies. And then the second one that we have here is Sustainalytics, which does a similar thing, which gives you ratings. So the question that you have to ask is, what are your sustainability and green product scores, and what are you doing to help these companies to ensure that your company gets a favorable rating? All right, step number 6, comparing alternative suppliers and products. And we find that there's 2 key tools that purchasing managers use, the first of which is internal and the second is external. The first are vendor scorecards, and these go by the alternative name of supplier scorecards, as well as supplier performance metric systems, take your pick. And basically what they are is an internal rating and review system. And at the better companies, what they will do is that they will have any customer employee who touches the product or deals with the supplier rate them on a variety of dimensions that are important to that particular company's success. They score them typically. They have these people provide comments, and then they aggregate them and come up with a composite score. And then typically these are shared internally via some sort of intranet with anyone who's interested in knowing something about the supplier. Now, often these are used by the operations folks for annual performance reviews, but increasingly they're used by purchasing managers to help them determine whether or not they should continue doing business with a supplier. Now, one of the things that we find is that purchasing and operations people don't necessarily supply these with potential suppliers. One of the things that you need to do as a marketing or salesperson is make sure you find out how your company is being scored and do whatever you can do to increase that score, because that may be the key to your company getting future business. All right, so that's internal. Externally, there are a whole series of online review sites that are out there, and you're probably familiar with these from the your consumer experiences. Yelp is a good example of that, where you have restaurant ratings. And typically the way these are set up is you have a series of overall ratings, which are quantitative, usually expressed by a series of 1 to 5 stars, 1 being poor, 5 being outstanding, and then a series of comments about that particular vendor. Now, a couple of the sites that we have discovered that turn out to be important these days are Vendop, and then a second one in the IT area is something called G2 Crowd. Now, there are a series of these additional sites that are out there. They tend to be industry specific. As a matter of fact, we found a company in Nashville that's actually providing a platform largely to associations that allow its members to evaluate suppliers. Now, as I mentioned earlier with online professional communities, the thing that's different about these rating sites from consumer rating sites is that members are vetted, in that you have to demonstrate that you are a legitimate supplier purchasing manager before they will ever accept your rating. And then secondly, most of them require you to prove that you have actually purchased and used a particular company's product. As a matter of fact, in some extremes, we find that they require their participants to supply invoices that demonstrate that, in fact, they have done so. All right, now, so again, internal versus external. Now, in addition, where do they find out? How do they compare suppliers? They go to the supplier's website. So you need to make sure that you have the information on your website that provides the customer with information that's needed to assess and then ultimately select a particular supplier. Now, at both extremes at the bottom, we look at economic factors, price comparison tools, and TCO tools, total cost of ownership. The example of price comparison sites that we have here is PriceItHere.com, and increasingly we find that you're moving towards an era of what might be called price transparency, in that everyone knows what everybody else's prices are. They report them on sites like this, so that it increasingly is possible to find out who's pricing what for which product. Now, a lot of these are run by trade associations. A lot of these are run by private consulting companies, but PriceItHere.com is one that does it. On the other side of the page, we have what are called total cost of ownership calculators. And basically what these are is they're apps that allow you, operations person or whatever, to evaluate the total cost of using a particular product. Now, again, when we use the term total cost, we're not just referring to price, but we're also talking about what might be called cost of use and then cost of disposal or recycling. So there are a lot of these tools that are floating around out there. One of them that we're familiar with is called the TCO Toolkit. And the unique thing about this is that you can access this on your smartphone, so that a purchasing manager or an operation manager can actually go through their plant, plug in the necessary data, and what this will do is provide you with an agnostic review. And what I mean by agnostic is that they don't favor going in one supplier over another. They let the numbers determine who is the most appropriate supplier. So these are some of the tools that purchasing people are using to compare suppliers and products. All right, now transaction management used to be the focus of the buying process, and this is where we actually place orders. Now, in the olden days, you'd have your salesperson that would come by your plant and write up the order on his or her order book. Well, today, not surprisingly, a lot of this is done online. So that, for example, in many industries, you have electronic request for proposals, requests for quotes. This has all been automated. Here's a couple of examples of companies that offer that service. In the lower right-hand corner, a lot of electronic buying, ordering, and payment is done online. And the classic example of that is Amazon Business, which is a cousin of the typical Amazon.com that you're all familiar with. Now, some of these are external sources like Amazon Business, but increasingly companies have actually put together online ordering or catalogs, I should say, that their operations people can use without having to go outside for place orders and things of that nature. Some companies, suppliers that is, actually help customers set up an inline or internal catalog. And the advantage of that is that obviously if you help the customer set it up, they're going to have a tendency to purchase your product. Now, the last category of these are what might be referred to as strategic sourcing and procurement systems, which basically try to automate the entire process, particularly as it regards strategic products, which Michelle mentioned earlier. So that might involve design of products and also come up with suppliers that you might not have thought of. So managing the transaction is our seventh, and that leads to the final of these, which is online supplier relationship and performance measurement systems. Now, the reason that this turns out to be important is that, in the olden days when we looked at the buying process, there was a beginning and the end, but increasingly today what's happening is that companies use fewer suppliers. They want to use suppliers again and again, and they want to have reliable suppliers. So what's out there are a whole series of these tools, and we can give you some examples here, which basically monitor the actual performance of suppliers, on a daily, weekly, annual basis. So you can find out who's delivering on time, what their prices are, what the quality levels are, and things of that nature, whatever is important to the customer as a whole. So that it's important that you understand what vendor management systems they're using, and obviously you want to make sure that you have good ratings, good reviews, so obviously they're going to continue the relationship with you. All right, now what's the future? And the future of this is fully integrated supply and procurement suites. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I gave you 8 different categories of tools, and one of the things that you find when you go out there is that there are a lot of vendors that are active in this space, but they tend to be small companies that are very entrepreneurial, that basically carved out a particular niche. To this point, there really aren't any that basically put it all together. Now, having said that, there are 2 companies, and their products are IBM, which is called Mtaurus, and then SAP Ariba. And both of these companies' goal is to fully automate the purchasing process so that a prospective supply manager or buyer never has to actually talk to a supplier, never has to do any research. It's all available. Now, I use the term suites here, meaning what? Well, there's all of this functionality floating around there. Everyone doesn't need each one of these applications. So it's a suite in the sense that you get to pick and choose and craft and integrate these things. And the buzzwords that are floating around out there are as follows: procure to pay suites, supply to pay suites. What's the difference there? Well, procure to pay suites allows you to pay, place an order and then pay for it. Supply to pay allows you to determine who the suppliers are all the way to the transaction, to the payment process. The more intriguing ones are configure to pay suites and configure to manage suites. A configure suite basically means that you design your product online with some sort of configuration software. It helps you select suppliers, pick suppliers, order from suppliers, and pay those suppliers. And configure to manage obviously takes that all the way down to the recurring management system. All right, so that's a good summary of what's out there and the kind of tools that you need to be aware of and the ways you need to respond to them. What I'm going to do at this point is turn it back over to Michelle, and she's going to talk to you a little bit about what the next step in our research process is. Michelle?
Great. Thank you, Jim. So Jim offered a thorough description of the recurring buying task and the customer journey and examples of services that are found within each of these tasks. Next, we built on this customer journey by examining two superordinate stages of the process, and that is order qualifying or disqualifying from consideration a pool of suppliers, and then this order winners, selecting the supplier that will actually win. So this qualification stage and this winning stage. And what we found is we surveyed purchasing professionals across the United States, and we asked about 17 different types of analyses that they may conduct at each of these 2 points in the process, qualifying or winning or both. And some of these analyses were about the supplier, and some of these analyses were about the product or the service. And there are 2 key points that I'd like to draw your attention to from this research, and that's first, what qualifies a supplier is not necessarily the same as what results in a supplier winning. And that's, in this case, the order qualifiers, what we found is that buyers find assessing the financial and legal risk, and Jim alluded to this analysis earlier, that assessing the financial and legal risk of a supplier is critical in the qualification process, in which a buyer is reducing down a substantial pool of suppliers down to a small few that they may actually consider. And then second, in the order winners, what we found is a portfolio of analysis on reliability and quality and price and TCO become very important. When we think about this research, probably the most important thing for the marketers and sales management folks to consider is what are they using to offer financial and legal risk assessment for their buyers across the board. Well, what's next from what we're doing? Jim and I are working as part of a body of this research beyond the U.S. borders and have decided to examine some cross-national differences and similarities in business-to-business customer decision-making. Jim and I are working with 3 colleagues in 3 different countries. We're working with Professor Luji Chen of China Europe International Business School, a worldwide leader in business education, and Professor Damien McLaughlin at the University College Dublin, Europe's leading research-intensive university, and Professor D.V.R. Seshadri at the Indian School of Business, which was co-founded by 2 McKinsey senior executives in the late 90s. I'd like to give you a flavor of some of our early findings as they relate to these digital tools. So we conducted cross-national surveys in China, Ireland, India, and the United States, and we found in our preliminary results a few key points that we'd like to share with you before we close up today. The first is that we have found that Chinese purchasing professionals use a much wider variety of digital tools more frequently. And our interviews suggest that this may be the case both because of a younger business-to-business customer that's simply open to a larger set of digital tools, and perhaps because of far more intense competitive pressures across a large collection of companies in this country. A second preliminary finding that we have found is that Ireland ranks second among these 4 countries in terms of the variety and frequency of tool usage. This may be because Ireland is home to many high-tech international companies. Third, we found that the United States purchasing professionals tend to use a narrow and more selective group of tools less frequently. And this may reflect a more mature, established procurement process here domestically in the United States. Fourth, we find that vendor scorecards, online trade association sites, online groups, and review sites are hot and certainly on the rise in all 4 of the countries. And the challenge for suppliers and sales management in general is that they're going to have to learn how to both legally and ethically influence these tools such that business-to-business customers have access to useful information about the company's product and services. Last preliminary result that we'll share with you from this international work is the fact that millennials are much more likely to use text, social media, online groups and review sites, and vendor management. Now, the big piece of this is that millennials have greater familiarity and usage of these tools in their personal life. And this is going to create demand and expectation for millennials to use these tools professionally. So companies, both customers and suppliers alike, will have to become far more proficient than currently in the provision and standardization and usefulness of these tools. So Jim will offer a few final thoughts before we close for our afternoon.
Okay, as I said at the beginning, Michelle and I have undertaken quite a bit of research, and we've got a lot of findings. Unfortunately, we weren't able to discuss it fully during this webinar, but fortunately you can find more at our research website, which is called engagementb2b.com. If you go to that site online, what you'll find not only are our research findings, but also podcasts, radio interviews, blogs, and articles that we have written in the past about this topic. More importantly, we have contact information, and we would welcome an opportunity to speak with you or communicate online or via social media about your experiences in either buying or selling in B2B markets. So once again, on behalf of Michelle and myself, I would like to thank you for taking the time to listen to our webinar.
Thank you.